And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, here with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Thank you, Garland.
US imperialism is flirting with World War III as French President Emmanuel Macron suggests sending EU troops to Ukraine. Joining us to discuss this and more, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, a historian, and a researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Western officials indulging in escalatory rhetoric should realize that they are effectively invoking the specter of an all-out nuclear war. Russian President Vladimir Putin warned in a speech to legislators in Moscow on Thursday. Dr. Horne, your thoughts to these very upsetting escalations?
Well, I think that the remarks of President Putin at the equivalent of the State of the Union address in Russia just the other day should be taken quite seriously. Let's sketch for a moment the backdrop. The backdrop includes not only these inflammatory remarks by the President of France about sending NATO troops to the battlefields of Ukraine, and this is the same Macron, by the way, who just a year or two ago spoke of NATO being near brain death. This is the same Macron who at a Munich Security Conference, the gathering for the neocon elite globally, had issued a veiled critique of this escapade and caper in Ukraine. But obviously, Mr. Macron is feeling the heat, feeling the pressure from left and right alike. And that helps to explain his erratic behavior and these untoward remarks. The backdrop also includes Chancellor Scholz, who, by the way, rebuked his comrade, President Macron, for suggesting that NATO troops should be dispatched to Ukraine. He, of course, said that German troops would not go there. But somehow the loose-lipped chancellor revealed that British troops are on the ground in Ukraine as we speak, that is to say, operating these notorious Storm Shadow missiles in Ukraine, targeting Russia, and bringing up that particular escalation should also remind us that before Mr. Macron made his rather intemperate remarks, recall that there had been a debate in NATO as to whether or not tanks should be sent to Ukraine, whether or not the so-called HIMARS should be sent to Ukraine. And there are those who suspect that given the fact that those particular kinds of weapons eventually were dispatched to the battlefield, that it'll only be a matter of time before NATO troops are dispatched openly and notoriously to Ukraine, because we need to recognize that NATO and the United States have stumbled into the worst of both worlds in the sense that it is enmeshed in a war it cannot win, but it can't afford to lose. And when you are in such a corner, inevitably, it leads to the kinds of intemperate remarks of Mr. Macron. It leads to Rishi Sunak of London dispatching the flower of British youth to an uncertain fate in Ukraine. What NATO has stumbled into is not only battling Russia, which is the largest country by population and territory on the old continent, endowed with vast natural resources, be it gas or oil or diamonds or gold, but also a substantial manufacturing base, which is now out-manufacturing the North Atlantic bloc in terms of all-important artillery shells. And by the way, it's being helped in that regard by its recently reborn tie to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And NATO not only is facing Russia, this European preeminent power, but Russia is backed by Asia's preeminent power, speaking of the People's Republic of China, carrying the number 2 economy in the world, a country that is the leader globally in terms of green energy, electric vehicles with BID basically outselling Tesla, the leader in terms of solar panels. In fact, do not be surprised that in the North Atlantic countries, there is a movement away from solar energy, believe it or not, because they feel that this will only be pouring lucre into the coffers of Beijing, since they'll have to buy solar panels from China in order to maintain a solar energy complex. China is also the leader in terms of rare earths, essential for all manner of goods and weaponry. And it's also the shop floor of the world. And so NATO, the United States, and its North Atlantic allies have stumbled into this conflict somehow with the leading power in Europe and the leading power in Asia. And I think taxpayers and U.S. citizens should ask themselves, how did all of these think tankers and bureaucrats at the State Department and the Pentagon that our dollars are helping to subsidize, how did they manage this kind of potential quagmire that NATO and the United States are now enmeshed in? I've not mentioned, of course, the role of Iran on the side of Russia and China, that is to say, this major energy producer with influential allies in Gaza, in Yemen, in Syria, and in Lebanon alike, all of the above backed by the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus Egypt, Ethiopia, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, which now collectively have a larger economy than the G7, that is to say, the United States and the Western European allies, plus Japan. So we have arrived at a new international situation that obviously the Pentagon and the State Department and the White House did not bargain for. And rather than making a sober assessment and trying to make the best out of this rather daunting situation, they're floating ideas about nuclear conflict. They're floating ideas about escalation in Ukraine. They're floating rather harebrained ideas concerning Russia supposedly putting weapons in outer space. At the same time, the United States refuses to carry forth with a negotiation on Russia about the militarizing of outer space. And so we see that this is a major defeat that has been inflicted upon the powers that have been dominating planet Earth for hundreds of years, and now are going to have to get accustomed to a bitter new reality.
Mondo Weiss, has a piece, "I Will No Longer Be Complicit in Genocide. U.S. Soldier Dies of Self-Immolation in Protest of War on Gaza." Talk about the impact of this act and what does it demonstrate to you in terms of this whole anti-Zionist movement gaining much more traction a lot faster than I think a lot of people ever imagined would happen?
Well, first of all praise is due to Aaron Bushnell, his latest martyr on behalf of anti-imperialism and indeed anti-Zionism. For me, it recalls the time when, in protest against the genocidal U.S. war in Vietnam, you had Vietnamese who were engaged in self-immolation in protest. And we all know how that conflict eventuated. That is to say, in April 1975, with the ignominious defeat inflicted upon U.S. imperialism, which continued to resonate throughout the decades. With regard to this anti-Zionist movement that you have made reference to, of course, we need to recollect what happened in Michigan just a day or two ago when Uncommitted in the Democratic primary achieved a stunning victory, insofar as it was thought that if 5% voted uncommitted, that would be significant, but it turned out to be north of 13%, which means that it's profound. You see that Marianne Williamson, who had suspended her campaign after getting 3% and besting Dean Phillips, who, unlike Williamson, has not been vigorous in terms of calling for a ceasefire, You see that Williamson has unsuspended her campaign because now she sees herself as a vector of anti-war sentiment within the ranks of the Democratic Party. This caused the ordinarily stumbling Mr. Biden to reveal while chomping on an ice cream cone that he expected a ceasefire by Monday. Now, this came as a surprise to both Hamas and Netanyahu alike, and perhaps Mr. Biden was reflecting his well-known and notorious habit of shedding brain cells, or perhaps this was some sort of sophisticated strategy of placing pressure on the two parties. We shall know by Monday, I would imagine. But in any case, we already know that Netanyahu is incentivized to continue this war because it delays his trial on fraud charges. It helps to elongate his stay in the prime minister's post and therefore escape prison. We also know that Mr. Netanyahu has no love lost when it comes to Mr. Biden. He probably sees this war as weakening Mr. Biden, which certainly it is, and therefore paving the way, perhaps, for Donald John Trump to return to the White House. Now, we also know that Mr. Trump was very upset with Mr. Netanyahu after November 2020, when Mr. Netanyahu sent congratulations to Mr. Biden on winning the White House. Mr. Trump saw that as a betrayal because, as you know, Mr. Trump and his minions have concocted this fiction that the election was stolen, and therefore it's unclear whether or not Mr. Trump will be as kind and gentle towards Mr. Netanyahu, assuming he returns to the White House in January 2025. But in any case, by prolonging this conflict, Mr. Netanyahu is clearly playing with fire. The Yemenis continue to impose militarized sanctions on Israel by halting shipping in a real sense to Eilat, the major Israeli port. We see news reports this past week of a possible escalation of this conflict between Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Israel. We already know that northern Israel has been virtually abandoned because of the missiles shot into that territory from southern Lebanon. The northern Israelis are now being put up in hotels in the center of the country, which is burdening the already stressed Israeli economy, which is losing altitude with every passing second. We also see that Israeli allies in the United States are engaged in a kind of immolation all of their own. What I mean is that the Zionists would like us to believe that they're the ultimate protector and shield for the Jewish American community. But by backing this genocidal war and attacking those on the left who oppose this war, they're creating fertile conditions for the continued rise of the U.S. right, which has been taking rather dangerous turns in recent days. I'm speaking of the Conservative Political Action Conference just the other day, where neo-Nazis were spotted and were rubbing shoulders with so-called conservative Republicans. I'm talking about these neo-Nazi marches in Houston, Texas, and Nashville, Tennessee, amongst other sites. And then, because of the pressure of this conflict, a major ally of the Zionists has been stumbling badly. I'm speaking of the New York Times, which is under fierce assault because just a few months ago, they published an inflammatory story alleging that Hamas on October 7th was involved in mass sexual assault. This story now has been debunked online by the Electronic Intifada, the Gray Zone, the Intercept, etc. And all that is awaiting is a self-examination and a self-critique of the Great Lady of Manhattan, speaking of the New York Times, but don't hold your breath. in waiting for that kind of self-critique.
Dr. Horne, a very important country, Indonesia, has had an election. There's some instability there as the ruling party has raised concerns about the conduct of this month's presidential election. What say you about Indonesia?
Well, this is a very tense situation unfolding in the world's largest archipelago, the world's largest predominantly Muslim nation, a country that has close ties to the People's Republic of China, but also has not burned bridges with the United States of America. Keep in mind, however, that the Chinese minority in Indonesia not only dominates the economy, which in recent years has led to pogroms targeting them, but the Chinese minority also has been influential on the political left in Indonesia, and that particular situation led and contributed to the bloody coup in Indonesia in 1965 that decapitated the left and set back Indonesia politically and economically for decades to come. However, Indonesia is also the world's major producer of nickel, also essential to the green economy. And given the strength that Indonesia wields within the so-called global South, speaking of the global majority, and given the fact that it has a predominantly Muslim population, this has allowed the specter that you might have noticed a few months ago when then Indonesia leader Joko Widodo was spotted in the Oval Office twisting the arm of Mr. Biden with regard to his unalloyed support for Israeli genocide in Gaza. So this situation in Indonesia has yet to sort itself out. The apparent winner of the recent election, the so-called massacre general, Prabowo Subianto, is under fire. He thought he had created a cushion when he created a vice presidential post for Mr. Widodo's son, who was below the age by which a leader of that country could be qualified constitutionally to run. But alas, that particular maneuver has not saved Prabowo Subianto from the pressure in the streets of Jakarta, the capital, particularly.
You mentioned he was seen in the Oval Office twisting the arm of President Biden. That doesn't seem to have gone very far, and the United States just continues to travel down this rabbit hole.
Well, that is for sure. And obviously, US imperialism is suffering reputational damage as a result of this bolstering and boosting Israeli genocide in Gaza. You might have seen the stories that are trickling into the mainstream press that suggest that it will not be long before those who identify themselves as U.S. nationals or European nationals may be assaulted in the streets of the global majority because they are seen as masters of hypocrisy. That is to say, backing this Israeli genocide at the same time, they're supposedly talking out of the other side of their mouths about a so-called rules-based international order, which obviously turns out to be nothing more than poppycock.
We've been speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, he's a historian, a researcher, and of course, a friend of the show. You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik.